people don't like ray tracing. In fact, some seem to absolutely hate it. The majority of console gamers don't use it, even when it's an option, preferring to run games in performance mode instead, while PC gamers are polarised. Some love ray tracing and how it makes the latest games look truly next-gen. Others hate the way enabling RT makes games feel less smooth and responsive. Maybe you can't even use it, or can't tell the difference between RTX off and RTX on, and think the whole world is trying to force the ray tracing gimmick down our throats. Or worse, that there's some kind of conspiracy to make games look bad and perform poorly to con us all into spending thousands of dollars on the latest RTX 5090 or whatever. I, on the other hand, don't mind ray tracing. In fact, I really rather like it. However, as someone who's always been on the less wealthy side of the PC gaming audience, I can understand why many people feel that this disruptive rendering technique that promises to revolutionise the gaming industry is actually a bad thing. When I was a kid, I was in love with CGI. Computer-generated imagery might seem like it's always been with us, but it's actually only been a part of TV and cinema for about the last 40 years or so, and it certainly didn't reach its peak until much more recently. I don't remember where I saw my first CGI, but as a kid who got obsessed with stuff easily, I very quickly made it my whole personality for a few months. I read books about it, bought Computer Arts magazine to see examples of it, and watched movies exclusively for the CGI. And trust me, there weren't a lot of reasons to watch Lost in Space 1998 starring Joey Tribbiani. Hell, I even tried to learn how to make CGI myself, despite it not being the kind of thing you got taught at school at the time, and certainly not having a computer that was up to the task. Often the final step of creating 2D art is rendering, or colouring in if you prefer. If you're creating something from your imagination rather than from life, you sort of estimate where the light should be coming from and where the shadows would fall. You colour the shaded parts darker and illuminated parts brighter. You draw shadows underneath and maybe kind of smudge them a bit the further they get from the point of contact in order to make them look more natural. In a 3D rendering environment, things are much less vibes-based and far more procedural. You simply place a digital version of your object into the scene, position a digital light source, and let the rendering software do the work. The most accurate way for a computer to turn the mass of data into a final rendered image is by a process of tracing each ray of simulated light as it passes through virtual space. This process is called, funnily enough, ray tracing. Ray tracing reproduces the way light naturally interacts with a scene according to an object's material properties, passing through transparent objects, bouncing off opaque ones, diffracting, diffusing, occluding, and so forth. As a method of rendering 3D images, it's historically always been a slow process. Nature can do ray tracing at the speed of light, but humans simulating it can only operate at the speed of computers. Early ray-traced imagery took so long to produce that even fairly short 24 frame per second animations could take weeks or months to render. In real life, light casts a basically infinite number of rays, but PC hardware is far more limited. By adjusting the number of rays being cast per light source, and the number of times each ray can bounce off something, it's possible to speed up or slow down rendering times, meaning images can either come out clean, realistic and detailed at the cost of a slower render time, or can be made more quickly but also more grainy, requiring noise reduction in post-processing. Because of this, ray tracing was mostly limited to use in pre-rendered sequences and stills. Real-time, noise-free, interactive 3D ray-traced environments rendered on a single computer were science fiction, the stuff of dreams, until recently. Thanks to leaps in technology, and a hell of a lot of marketing, real-time RT is now mainstream reality, available to the everyday consumer in PCs and game consoles, and featured in almost every major video game released in the last few years. Widespread access to this technology has the potential to change the games industry for the better. And yet, we're in a position where a significant part of the audience for this technology kinda hates it. How does that happen? How does a technology that could benefit everyone become part of the problem of modern gaming? Well, think of RT as like an absentee parent. We've learned to live without it. In the early days of video game graphics... Okay, scratch that. The earliest game graphics were made in ways that would be completely alien these days, and even up to the 8 and 16-bit eras, most games featured sprites that were directly bitmapped on 2D art packages or painted on paper and canvas by artists before then being digitized. Games like Doom actually used real sculpted models that were then photographed, scanned and retouched to create the sprites, and id apparently still has a lot of the original models. There were a few games that used sprites that were generated with 3D rendering software, like Donkey Kong Country, Toy Story, and Rise of the Robots, a so-called game I'm still pissed about 30 years later. These bitmaps were all technically ray-traced at some point. High-end workstations from companies like Silicon Graphics were used to render out individual frames of animation, which were then fed into the game in the same way a regular hand-drawn or scanned image would be. Whether a frame's drawn in deluxe paint or rendered in Lightwave makes no difference to the programmer, except perhaps in how long it takes to make each frame, but the end result is an image that's properly lit, with accurate shadows and reflections that represent what the objects are supposed to be made of. Ultimately though, while ray tracing was used in making the graphics, this was not really ray tracing. Artists searching for more realism were not limited to working with 2D sprites, however. Arcade machines and computers had already been using vector-generated 3D graphics almost since the beginning, but these wireframe models were crude, lacking any real sense of depth or scale. Once these polygons could be filled in, it became necessary to use lighting to give them a much-needed sense of realism and to make sure you could discern one polygon from another. This was, of course, basic stuff. All that was happening was that the different polygons were made darker or lighter relative to the position of the light source. If objects even had a shadow, it would be a simple transparent 2D shape projected under the 3D object. There were no actual shadows being cast. Still, this was mind-blowing at the time. Games like Star Fox and Virtua Fighter were the cutting edge of graphics in the early 90s, though the state of the art would move fast over the next few years. There was a big deal made about texture mapping, which essentially involved wrapping bitmaps over polygons to create details that were too small to be modelled in 3D and to simulate material properties like specularity that would normally require ray tracing to recreate. To work within the limits of the hardware of the time while giving the illusion of much more complex scenery, games like Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII took the Donkey Kong Country idea and mixed in live rendered polygons with pre-rendered backgrounds that wouldn't have been possible in real time. They were mostly limited to static backgrounds and cutscenes, or else you'd end up with some of those god-awful FMV games that the 90s were notorious for, but it was good enough to fool a lot of us who were too young and too infatuated with the new world of 3D graphics to tell the difference. This was all progress, but it still wasn't ray tracing. In lieu of any realistic way of achieving real-time RT, the art of developing 3D game graphics instead meant finding ways of simulating ray tracing in the simplest, cheapest way possible. You can't make a surface actually reflective, but there are a bunch of ways of faking it. Pre-render the reflections and hope the audience doesn't notice they never change. Or duplicate the whole scene's worth of geometry and invert it. Or use secondary cameras to capture the scene from a different angle. Or perhaps just make sure all the mirrors are cracked and corroded. The same held true for shadows, with techniques progressing from simple 2D bitmaps following characters around to dynamic stencil shadows that follow the shape of the object and the surface they're projected onto, contact hardening shadows that simulate umbral falloff, and ambient occlusion, to name just a few. For the sake of accuracy, you'd still have to say that this wasn't actually ray tracing, but even side by side, most people couldn't have told the difference. Ray tracing's effects could be achieved, by and large, without the computational cost of the real thing, but that didn't mean there wasn't a cost. By the 2010s, every major game release was made in 3D, often using vast art departments with dozens or hundreds of artists. They worked with wireframe mockups and low-poly proxies for speed, but eventually everything had to be rendered out. Even on the kinds of high-end editing PCs and render farms that would be found in game studios, it still took time. And with the ever-increasing scope of AAA games, changes in direction during development, and the demand for greater fidelity and realism, that time could pile up. Time is one of the main costs of any project, and it was one that even the biggest developers couldn't afford. By the end of the decade, it had almost become a running joke that launch dates were meaningless. The audience had become so used to games launching unfinished, with bugs and glitches and poor performance, that we started to take delays as a good sign that developers were putting the necessary care and attention into their work, that we weren't going to get another Assassin's Creed Unity, and that the actual employees weren't being overworked in the process. "It's done when it's done" was a sentiment we could all understand. Unfortunately, it seems like publishers could not. What developers needed was a way of lightening the load. If artists could just do the layout for an environment, place the lights and objects, and leave the whole rendering business to the end user's machine, it could potentially save a lot of time and money in development. It's like a digital camera, where you click a button and get instant feedback, rather than going through the effort and expense of getting a film processed, only to find you left the lens cap on. Unfortunately, even 10 years ago, a world where real-time RT completely replaced conventional rendering seemed like a pipe dream. To most people. In 2016, Q Games and Sony Japan released The Tomorrow Children, a third-person sandbox survival game for PlayStation featuring crafting, town building, mining, and apparently a lot of microtransactions. So far, so mid-2010s game, but there was something unique about this one. Lead developer Dylan Cuthbert, one of the pioneers of early polygonal 3D in titles like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, said that they wanted to achieve the kind of lighting found in Pixar movies, only in real time. For this, they used a technique called cascaded voxel cone tracing, which lends the game that familiar, slightly muted look that these days many of us would recognise as looking like ray-traced global illumination. Cone tracing is built into the game from the roots. All lighting is calculated in real time and reacts realistically as new landscape elements spawn in or are built or destroyed by the player. Light itself is a game mechanic. You have to carry your own light sources with you into caves and in the nighttime, and if your character strays out of the light for too long, they die and respawn back in the town. Pretty imaginative and impressive stuff for the time. The thing is, this was a PS4 exclusive, released even a month before the PS4 Pro. Q Games hadn't discovered some hidden ray tracing hardware in the 8th generation console that made them miraculously able to do what no one else could. They had to make compromises. Cone tracing is evidently less demanding than full-bore RT, but it's still pretty rough on the then already half-decade-old PS4 architecture. Models are on the simpler side, and everything takes place in a sort of matrix-like white void, with minimal vegetation and clutter to help cut down on the amount of stuff that needs to be traced. Even then, the impact of this lighting on performance could be severe. My capture footage is from a PS5 Pro. which has far more processing power than a PS4, as well as dedicated ray tracing hardware, but trailers and footage from 2016 show that performance could be pretty bad in busier scenes. Unfortunately, they didn't really have a chance to improve on this. The Tomorrow Children earned middling reviews and a relatively small user base. It only lasted 6 months before being withdrawn from the PlayStation Store. I was only able to play the Tomorrow Children because in 2022, Q Games bought the rights from Sony and re-released it as the Phoenix Edition, with all the microtransactions removed. As it is, the original 2016 version of the game didn't seem to have a significant impact on the industry at large, and there weren't any sequels or imitators to iterate on the technology. The possibilities of real-time RT for game development would have to wait. But not for long. In 2018, graphics card manufacturer Nvidia kickstarted the current RT revolution with their RTX series, the first consumer-oriented graphics cards to have ray tracing accelerators built in. This dedicated hardware could focus specifically on RT calculations and noise reduction, meaning that the real-time RT pipe dream was beginning to look like reality. This was big. Nvidia have been the leader in the PC graphics card market for about as long as there have been graphics cards. They actually coined the term GPU in the first place, and while they only supplied one of the 3 consoles at the time, their leadership in the PC hardware space often influenced AMD, Nvidia's main rival in graphics cards and developer of both Xbox and PlayStation consoles. With those two hardware juggernauts competing with one another, sooner or later, virtually everyone with a PC or console was bound to have access to real-time ray tracing. And once that happened, it would open the floodgates for game developers to switch to a purely ray-traced workflow. This was the dream. Not only would a pure RT workflow improve realism for gamers, but it would streamline the process of actually making the game in the first place, even allowing for small indie developers to have access to the kinds of AAA visuals previously only achievable by big studios. All the past efforts of simulating ray tracing would be unnecessary. Pre-rendering scenes, placing light probes, calculating shadow maps, all of these tricks that take up development time would become obsolete. With RT hardware in every PC and every console, a developer didn't have to worry about scaling back their designs to the degree Q Games did with the Tomorrow Children. They needed only to make sure the scene would render correctly on the user's hardware, and every subsequent change, every object moved, every piece of furniture smashed, every door closed and window opened, would be accounted for. Games could not only be made more efficiently, but imaginative developers could entwine RT into the very mechanisms of the game, and players would get to enjoy the most realistic visuals ever seen. Everybody wins. Were we ever that naive? Selling ray tracing to the public would be the first hurdle, and in some ways, they never got past it. RT needed a problem to solve, and when the actual problem is the uncontrollable doom spiral of development hell that AAA games were trapped in, with ever-escalating budgets and overworked teams rushed to unfinished buggy launches that could have been avoided if only they weren't so scared of pushing back the release dates, maybe you don't actually want to say that part out loud. From the average gamer's point of view, there wasn't a problem to solve. The developers who'd been faking the effects of RT for decades were pretty damn good at it, so when it came time to sell the benefits of ray tracing, marketing had to go hard. The RTX On campaign was heavy on rain-soaked streets in Cyberpunk 2077 and Watch Dogs Legion, and the stylized hyper-realism of Minecraft RTX. Once this actually emerged, however, consumer reactions were mixed. Enthusiasts like myself would have been easier marks, excited by the mere prospect of real-time RT, but to everyone else it looked like something they could live without. Not that they didn't want it, but that they didn't want the cost associated with it. As it turns out, the cost of RT was enormous. The first of Nvidia's ray tracing graphics cards, dubbed the GeForce RTX series, launched alongside the last group of GTX cards, with that legacy branding now reserved for cheaper, non-RT models. I think Nvidia hoped customers would perceive this new generation of GeForce as a radical departure from cards of the past. Sure, the 2080 was $100 more than the 1080 that preceded it, and still has the same amount of memory, but this is RTX. A whole new world of realistic lighting and reflections is surely worth a premium price. Alas, to all but the RT faithful, this didn't seem to be the case. Of the games that launched or were updated with ray tracing functionality, none of them showcased exactly what RT was capable of. Shadow of the Tomb Raider only used RT to render shadows. Battlefield 5 only used it for reflections, and the initial release of Metro Exodus only supported RT global illumination. It wasn't until Remedy's Control in 2019 that a widely available game would use ray tracing for shadows and reflections and GI, and it still didn't completely replace rasterized rendering. Even considering the relatively limited scope of ray tracing in these early games, the impact RT had on performance was staggering. Native 4K rendering was out of the question. The top-of-the-range RTX cards could run Shadow of the Tomb Raider at around 60 frames per second at 4K without RT, but turning it on cut that almost in half. An entry-level RTX 2060 could manage an acceptable 30 FPS without ray-traced shadows, and an unacceptable 18 FPS with them. Battlefield 5 was a competitive shooter, where smoothness of gameplay is of paramount importance, not only to pro gamers, but to anyone looking to have a half-decent experience. The RTX 2080 could provide 60 plus FPS at 4K, but only with RT reflections disabled. Even the 2080 Ti, the premium model released sometime after the initial RTX announcement, couldn't render 4K 60 with RT on, and the non-Ti model dropped as low as 40 FPS. Worse, for many people, the touted benefits of RT to image quality simply weren't there. Not that RT didn't work, nobody's sincerely claiming that there was some smoke and mirrors going on, or that it was a case of the Emperor's new clothes. Rather, that the effect was too subtle to be noticed. It often took a direct side-by-side comparison of static scenes to tell RT on from RT off, with even experienced professionals finding it easier to tell the two apart from the slower frame rates. The exceptions to the rule were games from years or decades past that had RT injected into them. The demo of 1998's Quake 2, with a full gamut of ray tracing features, was released for free to help sell the possibilities of RT, and it truly was transformative. For one thing, it transformed 1000 FPS into under 100, but it also made the game into a visual treat. The same went for Minecraft, a game known for its visual simplicity and low system demands, that turns into a work of art with RT turned on. The thing is, these exceptions are specifically because the original games started out with bad graphics, either developed too early to benefit from 2 decades of RT emulating trickery, or simpler games with a deliberately minimal aesthetic. Applied to games that already looked great, whose art had been developed to mimic ray tracing, the benefits of real RT were harder to see. It was far easier to spot the problems it created. Nvidia hadn't been oblivious to the impact RT would have on performance. It's no coincidence that the first generation of ray tracing enabled GPUs was also the first to feature deep learning supersampling, which ran games at lower resolutions and then upscaled them to a higher one. Typically, upscaling uses either spatial or temporal data. Spatial upscaling is easiest. It essentially moves the pixels further apart and fills in the gaps according to what the existing pixels look like. Temporal upscaling uses data from previous rendered frames to make a better educated guess at what should fill in those blanks, and often gives a more detailed image than spatial upscaling, at the expense of more errors and glitches called artifacts. Either way, the idea was to get the performance benefits of rendering at a lower resolution while mitigating the loss in image quality. Presumably, Nvidia's intention was that DLSS would give a lossless quality performance boost to offset the loss from ray tracing. The reality was, well, if DLSS is that good, players asked, why not just use it on its own, enjoy even higher FPS, and forget about RT altogether? The truth of the matter is, gamers aren't a monolith. Players of Control or Cyberpunk or even Minecraft might be better placed to slow down and enjoy the added realism now and again. But Battlefield 5 and COD players need ray-traced reflections like they need a hole in the head, and if they play with RT on, that's exactly what they're going to get. Granted, this was all first-generation technology, and given more time, RT performance would surely improve. However, there was never going to be a unified outcry from gamers demanding better RT. A large proportion of them simply didn't care. Nevertheless, whichever way the wind was blowing in terms of public opinion, the cat was out of the bag, and it wasn't long before gamers had more than one RT option. At the time RTX launched, their only active competitor for the gaming market was AMD, who were running a couple of years late to the RT party. The first products from the Radeon team to have ray tracing were their RDNA 2 series, built into the 9th generation consoles in 2020, and their own Radeon RX 6000 graphics cards shortly after. The fact that AMD even had a working RT solution within a single generation of Nvidia was impressive. Unfortunately, the reality was that they were still well off the pace. Comparing the top-end RX 6900 XT from 2020 to the older Nvidia RTX 2080 Ti saw a hefty 40% increase in performance during conventional rendering. However, enabling ray tracing narrowed that performance gap significantly, and sometimes even allowed the older Nvidia card to take a lead. Now, as I've presented it, that might not sound too bad. After all, that's a first-generation AMD flagship coming close to a first-generation Nvidia flagship in ray tracing, even beating it in some games. But there's a little more historical context required. The second generation of RTX cards had already been released by the time RDNA 2 hit the market, and a handful of games had begun to tease the idea of full end-to-end ray tracing, known as path tracing. This amped up, no-compromise version of RT could perhaps finally deliver on the dream of games made without any rasterized rendering whatsoever. Path tracing was incredibly heavy. This was the same technology that deleted 90% of Quake 2's FPS. Applied to a more modern game, with more complex models and scenery, PT was devastating to performance, leaving it virtually unplayable on both RTX 20 and RX 6000 series hardware. Path tracing would become a feature that was essentially exclusive to the top-end models of the RTX 30 series, and even then only with a fair amount of DLSS upscaling, which is exclusive to Nvidia. AMD would develop their own upscaling technology called FSR, which at the time of writing is on its 4th iteration and has almost closed the gap with DLSS. But the first version was one big step behind Nvidia in terms of quality. While there was technically nothing wrong with the ray tracing results being produced by Radeon graphics cards, the poorer quality upscaling meant for blurrier results than GeForce equivalents. All of this meant that Nvidia not only got to define what good ray tracing was, they also had the only way of delivering a playable version of it without compromising too far on other aspects of image quality. This wasn't a recipe for completely revolutionising the way games are made, it was a framework for a monopoly. At the time of writing this essay, the events I've just detailed are some 4 years in the past. Nvidia's 4th generation of RTX cards is launching, as is AMD's 3rd gen, and newcomers Intel have just started their 2nd. I'd like to be able to tell you that the intervening years have seen radical change, that things have shaken up in the world of ray tracing, but while it's been an eventful first half to the 2020s, there have been almost as many steps back as steps forward. The sad truth is that the proliferation of ray tracing could have progressed much further, had it not been for the perfect storm of bad conditions I call the scalper pandemic. During this 2-year period in which technology became a speculative investment, graphics cards were as rare as gold and significantly more valuable. I've gone into greater detail about the scalper pandemic before, but to summarise, like most industries, the production of graphics cards was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, demand for graphics cards skyrocketed thanks to an increased number of gamers, home workers, and crypto miners, sending prices through the roof both on the new and secondary markets. Because Nvidia's RTX cards were particularly good at mining Ethereum, their value among non-gamers went up dramatically. The second generation of RTX cards arrived right at the beginning of the scalper pandemic, vanishing from shelves in moments and then seemingly never returning. A battle between buyers and sellers ensued, with scalpers developing bots to snap up stock as soon as it arrived, and retailers retaliating with limits to the number of GPUs available per customer and giving preferential treatment to those willing to pay for a store membership. Meanwhile, the manufacturers were allegedly making backroom deals with large mining outfits to sell graphics cards directly, cutting out retail altogether. Throughout this insanity, prices continued to increase to the point where the average gamer couldn't afford even an entry-level RTX 30 series card, and owners of existing 20 series cards had either already sold them off cheap in anticipation of RTX 30's release, or sold them at an inflated price to crypto miners. As a result, the number of gamers able to actually enjoy ray tracing can't have increased much, if at all, between 2020 and 2022. By the time the third generation of RTX GPUs was ready to roll out, Nvidia already had dollar signs in their eyes. If people are willing to pay 2 to 3 times the MSRP on the 30 series, imagine what they'll pay for the 40 series. The RTX 4090 launched in September 2022 with an eye-watering $1,600 price tag. The RTX 4080 became 2 separate models, with the 16GB version listed at an $1,199 MSRP, the highest price yet for a card in its class, and the cut-down 12GB 4080 for $899. After some outcry from the public and the press, the 12GB 4080 was withdrawn, only to be relaunched later as a 4070 Ti with a $100 price cut, but that's arguably made things worse, and it made people suspicious. The conspiracy theory goes that Nvidia had decided they could get away with simply taking the model numbers from each GPU and moving it along to the next cheapest model. Hence, the 4060 is using components that should have been for a 4050, and so has a greater profit margin while only just beating the previous generation card. The RTX 4060 Ti can't match the 3070, except in instances where the older card lacks VRAM, and so the whole generation was tainted with the notion that Nvidia were ripping people off. As if that weren't bad enough, Nvidia also decided that this was the ideal time to start cutting corners they hoped nobody would notice. This corner cutting and penny pinching across the bottom half of the range mostly affected the cheaper, more popular tiers of GPU in the GeForce range, and therefore only served to continue limiting the proverbial good RT to the high end. Hopes were high then that AMD would take this opportunity and run with it. After all, Team Red's RX 6000 series had been a commercial success, in no small part due to the lack of reasonably priced GeForce cards to compete with them. Of course, greed and opportunism is an area where no tech company is lacking, and AMD's follow-up 7000 series was no exception. These cutbacks don't seem to affect RT performance, but on the other hand, AMD didn't do anything to improve it either. Their second generation of Ray-capable products debuted in late 2022, and if there had ever been any hope that it would be an RT revelation, it didn't last long. On the positive side, both the RX 7900 XT and XTX, at the very top of the product stack, had more RT hardware, with 84 and 96 compute units respectively. That meant they performed better than the previous generation 6900 XT and 6950 XT by virtue of brute force, as those older flagships only had 80 compute units. When AMD later released the 7900 GRE, which also had 80 compute units, it became clear that the new RDNA 3 architecture was offering little to no real improvements in ray tracing. For all the marketing talk, when comparing apples to apples across RDNA 2 and 3, the differences were minimal, far from the seismic improvement needed to compete with Nvidia. If there was ever an opportune moment for Intel to enter the GPU market, it was a few weeks earlier than they actually did. The Arc Alchemist series would have been ideally placed to snatch a sizable share of the low to mid-range market, if there were literally no other cards on shelves at the time. However, by the time of release, the supply shortages being experienced by AMD and Nvidia were starting to subside. Arc's selling points then were to offer what their competitors didn't. They were available with more VRAM than competing GeForces, and had better RT performance and better upscaling than competing Radeons. They were also reasonably well priced, though not quite the fire sale deals that many had hoped for. In fact, by the time I got my hands on a 16GB Arc A770, the retail price was higher than AMD's highly competitive RX 6700 XT. Intel have never been known for their driver quality, even back when they only made basic integrated graphics, and while they've clearly made a huge effort to solve problems as they found them, they had decades worth of catching up to do. Factor in the bizarre decision to initially ignore native DX11 support, leaving popular games like GTA 5 to be run through a painfully slow emulation layer, and Intel was still far from a mainstream contender. Now, a couple of years into Intel's character arc, many of those early glitches have been fixed, weird decisions have been reversed, and the new budget-priced Battlemage GPUs are being generally well received. However, now Team Blue has to reckon with its own mortality. The seemingly unsinkable giant of the tech world is in financial turmoil, and there are rumours that it might end up being acquired by another company. If that happens, or even if Intel just decides they need to trim the fat, their small, new, underperforming GPU division could be first up for the chop. By the end of the scalper pandemic, the GPU creators had recalibrated their expectations of what gamers were willing to pay for their top-end products. For mere mortals with less extravagant budgets, brands were now producing mainstream graphics cards with poor performance relative to their prices, and with cut corners in terms of memory and bus bandwidth. The models that could do reasonably well at ray tracing started at $600, and to get a good experience with path tracing, the kind that completely replaces rasterized rendering, the kind that's going to save gaming, well, that'll cost you about $1,000 or so. AMD was still offering slightly better value overall, as we've come to expect, but was still lagging behind in RT and absolutely useless at path tracing. Meanwhile, Intel were gaining ground in a race they entered 25 years behind the competition, and have RT performance that's quite impressive for the price. But Team Blue still has a small enough market share that they can't yet be expected to have much sway with game developers, and the company's GPU division might not last much longer. But then again, this is all a PCMR problem, right? Elitism is part of the game. If you want egalitarianism, you look to Xbox and PlayStation. If you want a feature to become universal, it has to be in a console. Whichever side of the console war you're on, the weapons are being supplied by the same manufacturer. AMD's stronghold on the two main console brands has been great for their business, but is now a real problem for ray tracing. Whatever your opinion is about the benefits of consoles over PCs, there's no getting away from the fact that the RT hardware in a base PS5 or Xbox Series console is based on AMD's first attempt at the technology. And it sucks. Yep, I know, console optimization and all that. I've certainly seen some evidence that's convinced me that a PS5 can extract more out of AMD's architecture than a Windows PC can, And GTA 6 may prove to be the exception to the rule. But the first 4+ years of the PS5 and Series X have seen precious few instances of good ray tracing in console games. The few that do perform well with RT enabled use the technology sparingly, perhaps in 1 or 2 areas, while still leaning hard on traditional rasterization. Once more, RT isn't streamlining game development, it's just another thing on the list of things that have to be included in a game in order to make it next gen. In early 2024, things look like they might be turning around for consoles. Leaks emerged that Sony would be complementing their baseline PlayStation 5 with a new Pro version, and that the specific focus of this new premium console would be ray tracing. The leak suggested that the new model would feature 60 compute units, a 66% increase over the regular PS5, and that it will benefit from 2 to 3 times the ray tracing performance. This didn't add up. A 2/3 increase in RT cores shouldn't increase performance by that much, unless something else was also changed, and that suggested that Sony had implemented something new. Perhaps AMD's then unreleased RDNA 4 architecture was the secret sauce responsible for this increased per-core performance. After the PS5 Pro became official, interviews with Sony lead architect Mark Cerny hinted at the likelihood of the presence of next-gen AMD hardware in the new console, so people took that to mean RDNA 4 was confirmed. As it turned out, it's more complicated than that. The new console runs on RDNA 2 hardware, the same as the regular PS5. It has a 16.7 teraflop GPU, about 2/3 faster than the model in the regular PS5, with the same 60 compute units as had already been leaked. This sucked. It meant the PS5 Pro would only have the ray tracing ability of an already existing AMD graphics card, the Radeon RX 6800, which, while perfectly good in its own right, don't come at me 6800 owners, isn't renowned for its RT prowess. However, there was some relief for RT fans. According to a later presentation by Cerny, while the PS5 Pro is still RDNA 2 based, it does indeed have RDNA 4 technology, specifically in its ray tracing cores. This news inspired some short-lived hope that the PS5 Pro would be leading the charge for actually good console RT. But, now that reviews have actually come out, that hasn't really been borne out. Alan Wake 2 still looks better on a PC with low ray tracing than the PS5 Pro does in its quality mode, and the PS5 Pro's reflections use a much more simplified version of the scene. This is all done in the name of playability, of course, but the fact that this reduced quality still only runs at 40 FPS or less on this Pro console isn't a good look. The touted performance improvements of the PS5 Pro's ray tracing over the base model seems to have as much to do with their new DLSS-like upscaler, PlayStation's Spectral Super Resolution, as any real architectural improvements. While this might represent a useful improvement over the regular PS5, it probably isn't going to be enough to enable any new or unique gaming experiences on the PS5 Pro, or to bring consoles in line with PC gaming. And I don't know, maybe we shouldn't have expected it to? The language of PS5 Pro and premium console is still treating ray tracing like a white elephant, a unique and special graphical feature for connoisseurs with deep pockets, rather than the new normal we need it to be. Perhaps the fact that this PS5 Pro isn't a ray tracing game changer actually isn't a bad thing, if all it's going to do is condition console audiences to expect better ray tracing to be more expensive. All we can do is hope that by 2028, when Sony and presumably Microsoft are unveiling their 10th generation machines, that they won't be quite so disappointing in terms of RT. Rather than becoming the saviour of game development, RT is a hardware arms race. Rather than revolutionising graphics, ray tracing is just another feature for marketing the latest and most expensive graphics cards. Instead of replacing the old, slow method of making graphics, ray tracing is just one more mode to worry about. And developers not only have to find a way of shoehorning this new rendering mode into their games, they have to contend with the lackluster first-generation RT technology of the base consoles, or else risk being unplayable to the majority of gamers. Plus, other rendering technologies haven't exactly stood still. New methods of faking RT make it even harder to identify the real thing, and thanks to the RT-enabled graphics cards that artists also have access to, the time to render out a project isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. The more ray tracing permeates gaming culture, it seems, the less we need it. This hasn't necessarily stopped developers from trying. Much like that PS4 game from 2016, titles like Star Wars Outlaws use a kind of RT global illumination that doesn't need specialist RT hardware to run. This more hardware-agnostic form of RTGI, which I'll call software ray tracing even though I don't think that's quite accurate, is still extremely heavy on graphics hardware. The PS5 and Xbox Series X consoles are already struggling in some modern games, and in this case have to resort to rendering at a resolution below 1080p to get a stable frame rate. Other games like Black Myth Wukong and Stalker 2 use a similar system called Lumen, built into Epic's Unreal Engine 5. UE5 doesn't have a great reputation with gamers. Many of its impressive graphical features are offset by sky-high system requirements to achieve them, with weaker hardware relying on performance enhancers like upscaling and frame generation, resulting in softer images, visual artifacts, and latency. It should also be pointed out that this weaker hardware I refer to is often still stronger than the graphics cards found in most gaming PCs. According to the latest Steam hardware survey, the most popular graphics cards in use today are the RTX 3060 and 4060, making up about 15% of the market between them. The 3060 is generally a little weaker than the PS5, while the 4060 has a VRAM deficit that will directly affect its ability to do stuff like ray tracing and frame generation. It is somewhat heartening to see desktop RTX cards at the top of the survey, especially as not so long ago these things were as rare as rocking horse droppings. But the fact that neither of the top two cards can run some of the most popular games without faking pixels or frames is, frankly, a bit depressing. While we're on the subject of depressing facts, a big part of how real-time RT is possible at all is noise reduction. As I mentioned earlier, real-time RT uses a small number of rays, which causes more noise, which then has to be removed. Noise reduction isn't all created equal, and some kinds are more effective than others. The best kind, like Nvidia's ray reconstruction and AMD's newly announced ray regeneration, use AI. But that reintroduces the same problem we have with upscaling. It's proprietary, meaning it's only available on specific hardware, and it's not widely implemented in games right now. Thankfully, both of these popular graphics cards work with ray reconstruction. Sadly, at the time of writing, it's only available in about a dozen games. That means we're largely stuck with inferior methods of noise reduction, which brings with it weird artifacts like ghostly trails, halos, and sparkling effects around moving objects, or whenever the camera pans around. Sometimes it can take a few frames for a full RT scene to load in. The end result of all these little glitches is that many people's first experience of ray tracing has been that it can actually be quite ugly. Factor in the already well-established performance drop coming from rasterized rendering, as well as other indirectly related issues like Unreal Engine's frustrating problem with stuttering, and it's no surprise that a significant portion of the player base thinks of ray tracing as a bad thing. If RT could completely replace rasterized rendering in 3D games, it would help shorten development times, cutting down costs, helping eliminate toxic crunch conditions in studios, and reducing the likelihood of games being launched in a buggy, unfinished state. Moreover, RT could be better for the industry at large. It helps smaller teams create AAA-style visuals for their indie and AA game projects, helping them earn credibility with the section of gamers who still associate indies with pixel art and walking simulators. Sadly, none of this gets to happen while RT hardware is treated as the premium luxury option. Shifting the burden of rendering everything onto the gamer's machine means hardware is more relevant than ever, and right now, it seems like the majority of PCs and consoles simply aren't ready for that burden. If base model consoles and mainstream graphics cards could trace rays quickly enough, in large enough quantities with effective noise reduction, all without resorting to aggressive upscaling and frame generation technology, RT could become truly mainstream, rather than being associated with slow, blurry, grainy games that look and play worse than they did without it. For as long as Nvidia get to hold the monopoly over the proverbial good ray tracing, that means it will remain exclusively in the realms of PC gaming. Unfortunately, that means they also get to say how much it costs. Ray tracing could help save the gaming industry, but first, somebody has to save ray tracing. PC hardware is always in a state of flux, so anything I say here is likely to age poorly. As I write this, the RTX 50 series graphics cards have been released, and while there's a lot of unrealised, forward-looking technology and some major improvements to upscaling and noise reduction, there's nothing you'd call a generational improvement in terms of raw processing power. Arguably, more power isn't what's needed to make RTX the saviour of ray tracing. What's needed is mid to high-end performance for an entry-level price tag. But what we're getting is frame generation and lies. AMD finally revealed their latest generation GPUs after a somewhat sheepish launch, and despite not going toe-to-toe with Nvidia at the very high end, the rumoured boost to ray tracing performance turned out to be true. Granted, that's still a long way short of where it needs to be, but it's a step in the right direction, and it shows that AMD are capable of competing, if only when it comes to graphics cards that cost more than a whole console all by itself. Intel meanwhile remain a question mark. Their business woes hang over everything they say and do, so while the Battlemage generation started off well, there's a chance it won't get any better. The B580 has been a hit with a good price point and performance that exceeds their previous flagship, despite some controversy around its viability in cheaper PCs. A theoretical high-end Battlemage with more memory and better RT performance at a competitive price could be just the thing to light a fire under the market. But at the time of recording, that model is still hypothetical. Right now, I have no real evidence that Nvidia, AMD or Intel have any intention of bringing quality, industry-changing ray tracing to the masses. And by that I mean people who can't justify spending over $500 on graphics cards. If none of the main GPU players is going to democratise good quality RT hardware, perhaps the answer lies outside of graphics cards? Real-time ray tracing was being performed on computers way before Nvidia brought out the first RTX series, and by the mid-2000s there were even experiments in gaming. Versions of Quake 3, 4, Quake Wars, and Wolfenstein were developed by Intel engineers to run with ray tracing, though at below 30 FPS and only 720p, and using monstrously expensive quad CPU systems to achieve it. CPUs have improved a lot over the last 20 years, but games are a lot more complex too. Many modern games are already easily CPU limited, so even if a modern Ryzen or Core Ultra could handle RT, I don't think it could do so while still running every other aspect of the game. As we've seen with games like Black Myth Wukong, it is possible to perform RT without RT hardware. Engines like CryEngine, Unreal and Snowdrop have all proven capable of limited ray tracing without dedicated RT cores, though so far that's mostly resulted in lower quality, noisier images and fewer RT effects, and often at pretty poor frame rates on non-RT hardware. The hope is that there's still room for software RT to improve. There are already a few examples, mainly of indie games, which can perform more advanced ray tracing effects in software, such as Tiny Glade and Teardown. Neither is what you might call a game in a traditional sense. One is a toy for building up castles and other medieval style buildings, the other is a toy for tearing shit down. Tiny Glade uses a comprehensive RT global illumination system, so that everything you build, every object you place or move or shape, has its lighting and shadows calculated instantly and realistically, without every permutation having to be pre-rendered beforehand. Meanwhile, Teardown uses a fully path-traced voxel engine, allowing for lighting to perfectly adapt to the shape of buildings as you rip them apart. Despite the use of so-called mandatory ray tracing, both games can run on fairly old, low-end hardware, with Digital Foundry finding that Tiny Glade ran perfectly well on an Nvidia GTX 1060, a relatively inexpensive non-RT graphics card from 2016, and the minimum requirements for Teardown also don't include RT hardware. Of course, right now, this software RT isn't as good as hardware RT. The reflections are less detailed, there's more noise, fewer bounces to each ray of light, and you could argue that a well-made rasterized game could still look better than this, and perform better too. I'd argue, however, that software RT has the potential to be good enough. Maybe with a little more optimization, we could see more games that use software RT exclusively, like Star Wars Outlaws and Stalker 2, only hopefully without the sky-high system requirements. Developers aren't making ray-traced games out of pure altruism. They stand to benefit in terms of more time saved in development and less time required to fix the game post-release. More realistic lighting and reflections are simply the hook, the way they're gonna sell RT to you in a way that makes you think it's entirely for your benefit. But the high system requirements have so far done little but undermine that message and make more cynical consumers assume that RT is all a big scam, perpetrated by the developers in collusion with big graphics. While I'm not going to suggest for a moment that switching to a fully RT workflow is a magic wand that'll make all games release on time and prevent studios from being shuttered for failing to meet expectations, the people who actually make games in the 2020s need all the help they can get. Alas, gamers don't seem to have much goodwill towards developers these days. From the comments on YouTube videos, I get the impression that a portion of the PC gaming community feels that rasterized graphics are good enough, that the mess of upscaling and frame generation and noise reduction that comes with ray tracing often makes games look and feel worse, and perhaps that if a game needs RT to survive, then maybe it's not worth saving. I don't disagree, at least not entirely, and right now it's not easy to defend ray tracing because the hardware simply isn't good enough. Oh, perhaps it's good enough at the top end, the RTX 5090s that'll be owned by a fraction of a percentage of gamers, but consoles, and the graphics cards that will be owned by the majority of people, still have a long way to go, and I think that means we're probably going to see more games with software RT as a default, with heavier hardware RT effects as optional extras for owners of premium gaming rigs. What is clear to me, given the benefits to gamers and particularly to developers, is that they're going to move heaven and earth to make sure RT becomes a universal thing. There's no returning to a pre-ray traced world now. To return to my photography analogy, digital cameras started off bad. I mean appalling. You could spend thousands of dollars only to get 2 or 3 megapixels, while at the same time you could scan a piece of film and potentially get dozens of megapixels out of it, with less noise and more dynamic range. To love digital photography back then, you had to forgive the terrible quality and other quirks of the early digital cameras for the convenience of having instant feedback. It took the better part of a decade for the pixel counts to increase, the noise levels to drop, and all the bugs to get ironed out before digital replaced film for the majority of people. There was an awkward phase in the middle of that decade where camera developers were throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck, like using hexagonal pixels and built-in interpolation to pretend there were more pixels than there actually were. We're in that awkward phase now with ray tracing, where the power isn't there, so we're left relying on imagined pixels and fake frames to close the gap. In photography, we barely remember the before times anymore. A handful of people hang on to film, but rather than being the best quality option, it's now a quirky niche interest. Perhaps that's the future of rasterized rendering, a subgenre of nostalgic games made for an audience who fondly remember the times when light came from nowhere and ambient occlusion just meant drawing dark halos around the edges of stuff. Ray tracing will be the new norm that all games are built upon, and nobody will complain about it because there won't be any downsides anymore. Graphics will be realistic, games will play well and be easier to make and launch on time, and well, alright, let's not kid ourselves, developers will still be closed down by their greedy and irresponsible parent companies, because all that will really happen is that deadlines will be tightened and expectations will increase. On the other hand, small teams of developers won't find themselves limited to less graphics-heavy genres or smaller world spaces anymore. The next Cyberpunk, GTA, or Breath of the Wild could be made by an indie. All of this is a fantasy, of course. An idealised vision of what real-time ray tracing could be if only reality would stop getting in the way. If graphics cards would stop being hijacked by crypto bros and AI evangelists. If Nvidia lost their monopoly over good RT. Or if someone found a way of path tracing that didn't require a supercomputer. Maybe everyone would stop hating RT and go back to not caring about it. As someone who was a fan of ray-traced CGI back in the day, having it appear almost fully formed as a playable, real-time thing in actual games was a dream come true. But to have it reduce otherwise playable games to a laggy, stuttering, ugly mess was a nightmare. Now, seeing it dragged across the internet by angry gamers and content creators is almost worse than having no RT at all. Worst of all, they're not wrong. I hope you enjoyed this, the first full-length video essay on iceberg lore. I also have a short video on the topic of ray tracing in the form of a debate between someone who's in favour of RT and someone who's very much against it. The con argument is being voiced by fellow YouTuber TechDweeb, who also provided the artwork, and there's a link to that video below if you haven't seen it yet. As this is a new channel and one that might not attract any sponsors for a while, I'll be enabling memberships as soon as it becomes available. If you enjoyed the video, and you can see the option in the doobly-doo, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider becoming a channel member, which in the future will grant you early access to my essays, as well as exclusive content made just for you. Thanks for watching.